Hello and welcome to the latest episode. My name's John Petley. I'm the senior researcher at the Institute of International Monetary Research. And my guest today is Ewen Stewart, who has recently taken on the post of our new director. Welcome, Ewen.
John, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Thank you.
Now, obviously, the first question to ask you is, what were the reasons why you agreed to come to the Institute to take on this job and to be our new director? What really inspired you about joining us?
Well, sometimes something like a lightning bolt comes out of the blue. And I got a call from the chairman, Tim, and he asked, would I be interested? And it was a role that immediately hugely appealed. I've been following the work of the Institute for many years, and I've known Tim off and on for 20 odd years in a variety of different guises, and I've admired his work and the work of the Institute. And it just seemed like a great opportunity. I think this is a critical point in the West generally, and in Britain in particular. And I think the role of monetary policy is a critical aspect of the jigsaw of trying to resolve what I think are profound problems facing Western economies. And I've been very taken by Tim in his career over many years, being at the heart of government, and then the idea of falling out of fashion. And I think this is a critical moment to get monetarism back to the center of the debate and the wider debate about how government's role in society. So I view this as a huge opportunity, and it was greatly honoured to be given the chance.
It'd be interesting to see how you'll manage to integrate our focus in the Institute on money targets with the broader economic questions. And that's really perhaps the next question I'd like to raise with you. We look at our country at the moment, it's obviously in quite a bad way in a number of ways, but particularly as far as the economy is concerned. Would you like to elaborate on what you see perhaps as being the main challenges we face as a country at the moment on the economic front?
Yes, thank you, John. I think there's a lot of issues here. You know, at the start of my career in the 90s, Britain was a beacon. It was a centre of prosperity. We were fairly lightly governed. Taxes were reasonable, and there was a long period of great stability. The car crash, as I see it, that we see today, hasn't happened overnight. I think the Reeve and Starmer government is pretty disastrous, but actually, in fairness to them, this is a car crash that's happened over about 30 years, with a gradual unpicking of the small state towards a very large, highly regulated state. So almost in every aspect, government has become the main architect in the country and taken, I think, oxygen away from the private sector. And I think this has been extremely detrimental both to growth and wealth. And I think we've now reached a point where the state is almost half the entire economy, where we've had, in my view, fairly extreme monetary policy really since the Carney period. And we've had a huge increase in regulation. And with it, taxes at the highest level for 70 or 80 years in this country, and a flow of capital that's leaving the UK. So we're, I think, in a death loop. And I think we have a clear choice. We either try and break that loop by focusing on the private sector, by trying to reduce the dependence on the state, lowering taxes, and actually continuing with a sound monetary policy as possible to maintain stable prices. Or we continue down this route where the government believes the state knows best, and at best we'll get no growth, and at worst a very serious diminution to our prosperity.
That's interesting, because obviously one of the things about monetarism is that the whole philosophy of it is get your level of broad money growth at the right level, just keep it sustainable. And really, it's a case of not quite letting the economy run itself, but very much implying a hands-off approach by the government. In other words, it's saying, get the money supply numbers correct, and the government doesn't really need to do that much. I mean, that goes so much against the grain, not only of this particular government, but as you say, of the government's approach going right back to the end of the 1990s.
I'm afraid that is correct. I think one of the very appealing things about monetarism is exactly what you've said. It should be relatively laissez-faire. Unfortunately, when the government becomes the main actor in the state, and the government, when Tony Blair became prime minister, was about a third of the economy. Today, it's just under half the economy, but it's actually much greater than that because whole industries which were lightly regulated a generation ago, like financial services or energy or employment rights and all the rest of it, are now extremely tightly regulated. So the government is the overwhelming actor, and that impinges on monetary policy. And one of the key recent examples of that is what happened during lockdown, where the government closed the economy down for health reasons, which we could debate. Let's not go into that debate today, but ended up printing 400 billion or thereabouts to fund furlough and other schemes. And funnily enough, the impact on the money supply, as you and Tim pointed out, was profound. And sure enough, there was a substantial monetary shock. I think the problem we face today is that much of the excess spending that we had over the COVID period has stuck. And I see a great danger that governments will be tempted to monetize deficits as they find it harder to increase tax yet further. And that, of course, isn't a free lunch. It runs the risk of inflation. I think if we can't break that cycle and resize the state to something much closer to historic norms, we are going to face a continuing risk of debasement.
So you mentioned the COVID shock.
Yeah.
I mean, up until then, although as you were saying, this malaise, this problem we've got in our economy goes back really to the Blair years. It certainly seems to have got worse since the COVID shock. I mean, in the 2010s, the great moderation, as I'm sure it's not just Tim who refers to that period. Yes, money growth was low, productivity was certainly not what it has been, but it was adequate. We were ticking over. Since 2020, and particularly since the last couple of years, our growth has now become anemic. I mean, why has it got even worse? Is it simply this big state overreach that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger?
Well, on the eve of COVID, the government spent about 880 billion a year. And today that's 1.3 trillion 5 years later. But after inflation, public expenditure has increased by 200 billion in real terms. That's an unprecedented increase. Yeah, outcomes have not improved over that period. In fact, in many senses, public sector outcomes have deteriorated. Government measures public sector productivity. It's worse than it was in 1997. That's an extraordinary statistic when you consider the technological advances there's been, elsewhere in society. How can it conceivably be that government is producing less per head than it was a generation ago? What we've decided to do is to swap a relatively creative and productive private sector into a very unproductive public sector. And I think that's crowded out the private sector. I think it's also is now stressing the monetary equation. Britain's running a deficit despite record taxes of 160 billion a year. That deficit looks to me to be embedded without economic growth, which is the main variable on the fiscal deficit, given the government's racking up extra costs in terms of minimum wage rising, other regulatory costs. Public expenditure is growing structurally. It doesn't need to, but the government's actions are making it grow structurally. So the government either has to raise more money on tax, given its policy, or possibly monetize that debt. So far, they've chosen to raise taxes. We will see what they do in the medium long term, but the temptation to monetize that, I think, is quite great.
Yes, we've seen that happen in so many countries, and of course, in the most extreme cases, we know how inflationary that can be. Now, you obviously emphasised in the things you've said that you've had a long-term interest in fiscal policy,
Yeah.
and you were blaming it fairly and squarely, an incompetent fiscal policy, on the fact that we are in a mess today. Now, that's actually taking quite a different view from some parts of the commentariat, who for years, really since we voted nearly 10 years ago to leave the EU, have said that, well, it's Brexit that's really the cause of our problems. Had we not left the EU, our economy would be doing much better than it is now. Now, obviously, I know as that you have very enthusiastically supported our decision to leave the EU. How would you like to refute the claim that really our economic woes are the fault of leaving the EU?
I think people that argue that are taking a theological stance, to be honest. Even if you supported Remain, and there were reasons to do that, to continue to blame Britain's problems on Brexit is frankly laughable, I would suggest. Um, the decision to leave the European Union pales into insignificance with the economic shock from COVID and lockdown. It is a very small event in that context. But if you want a specific rebuttal, I would look to three or four things. First of all, those that supported Remain suggested there be a substantial fall in the UK's population as Europeans left the UK. That hasn't happened. In fact, the population in aggregate of the UK has continued, for good or ill, to increase. The second thing is that if you actually look at the UK's trade figures with the European Union, actually, as a trajectory, it's pretty well unchanged. You've got to take away what happened over the period of lockdown, which clearly was hugely disruptive, not just here, but throughout the world. But the UK's trade with Europe has recovered reasonably strongly, largely in services. But the delta on trade has been minimal. Thirdly, I would say, and this is criticism of the British government, that Britain has not used the opportunity it could have done to diverge from the European Union. We could have moved, it's often called Singapore on Thames. That's not really description I like, but it's shorthand for saying we could have deregulated the city to a much greater extent. We could have taken a more free market approach to energy. We could have taken a different approach to labour relations. And in each case, we haven't. In terms of the city, we've largely gold-plated. In terms of a free market in energy, we've done exactly the opposite. We've out-Europed Europe in terms of net zero. And in terms of employment regulation and a regulation on property and all these other areas, we've moved much closer to the continental European model. So actually, the response of those that govern us is to make Britain more like Europe, not less like Europe, which is exactly the opposite of what the people actually voted for. But the last point I would make is I passionately feel part of European civilization. I love Europe. I love the culture of Europe. I consider myself British and I consider myself European. But the European Union, to my mind, has gone tragically wrong. It's become a highly bureaucratic, centralized force. And I think Europe was at its strongest when it was a diverse, diffuse continent based around common values, but actually much more creative and innovative. And this is coming through in the very significant underperformance of Europe. The British economy is doing badly. Let's make no bones about that. But the European economy is also doing extremely badly. Just this week, we have the umpteenth new French Prime Minister. Bond yields spike again in France, but it's not really about that. France is running a massive fiscal deficit. Germany is suffering a growth crisis. Europe is the low growth, low productivity, failing continent in the world, and Britain is failing as well, by the way. And it's not just a rich part of the world that's declining. You might say, well, of course, Asia will catch up from a lower base. It's not true. Australia, Canada, the OECD, the United States of America are all growing about twice the rate of the European Union. The reason that our continent is failing is we've followed very poor policies for a long time. So I think that Britain should be, of course, closely aligned with European values, but I think the European Union is the problem, and we need to get back to a much more free enterprise, smaller state, and trust the people and be creative.
As you mentioned, that our trade with the EU has actually held up very well through the post-Brexit period. This, of course, just carries on from the point that you've just made. We really do need, if we're going to see this country recover, to reorientate our trade away from what is essentially an underperforming, over-regulated trading bloc on our doorstep, and somehow go back to being the global trading force that we used to be, and devote our energies really to building up our trade with the countries you mentioned, the countries that really are doing well and really are going to be much more useful partners for us in the future, without at the same time trying to completely ignore our important trade with the EU.
Well, I would leave trade to companies to decide where they want to trade. So, if they can trade with France or Germany, that's splendid. They can trade with India or America, that's equally great. But the sheer weight of numbers and the weight of change and growth demonstrates that, and a long-term trend is likely to continue, that our trade with Europe as a proportion of our total trade is likely to decline. And indeed, that has been the case with the odd peak and trough for a very long period of time. We should be in a uniquely strong position in this country. Many of the services that we have competitive advantage in are in structural growth, be it legal services, business services, financial services, some of the academic services that we can offer. And English is a huge advantage we've got in terms of language. So I think if we can break this cycle, we can start actually to break the doom loop really quite quickly. But I think you're right. I think the premise of your question is right, that trade is gradually moving away from Europe to Asia, to America and other parts of the world. And I don't see that trend changing. Unless Europe, of course, has a road to Damascus moment and starts to rediscover its mojo. But it's given no pleasure to say so. There's not much sign of that.
I think I'd agree with you. They seem to be just determined to plough the same furrow. And I think the net result is going to be just more stagnation, just more decline, which, we both agreed we need to move away from this. We're a great country with lots of potential. We could do so much, and certainly we could improve our trading relationships with the rest of the world. But my final areas I'd like to talk through with you is something very much that's key to that, and it's something very much part of life in this country. The behaviour of the Bank of England, especially Governor Andrew Bailey. He's faced a lot of criticism, especially since that inflationary episode in 2021 to 23. As you're obviously aware from having read Tim's notes, we as the Institute were warning that it was going to be inflationary really before anybody else. March 2020, Tim sent out a note saying the actions taken by central banks around the world, including the Bank of England, in these enormous QE programs, added to the monetization of the fiscal programs at that time, was going to be inflationary. And yet we were really a voice crying in the wilderness. And certainly the Bank of England didn't really take a lot of notice of us. Do you think that the criticism that Andrew Bailey has faced from this inflationary attitude is justified? And if so, what advice would you give him?
I'm afraid I think it's wholly justified. Andrew Bailey, along with thinkers at other major central banks, believed there was going to be deflation, or at the very least, they believed that inflation would stay within the 2% target. And they believed this because during the COVID period, the economy was locked down and they saw an economy working at less than capacity. And they simply thought that this would be, they were more worried about deflation than inflation. They simply didn't look at the money supply, or if they did, they dismissed it. I've been involved in investments in various areas for the last 30 or so years. And it is in life quite rare that there are seminal moments, really red flags, where something happens and you think, this is bound to have this effect. And as you and Tim pointed out, the money supply grew, broad money grew very rapidly in March, April 2020, the fastest it grown for 30 or 40 years. Central bank continued to say this was going to be deflationary. Funnily enough, 18 months down the line, inflation spiked. Even today, though, they don't really recognize that. They would blame the war in Ukraine and they would blame supply side shocks. But I think if we're objective and we look very carefully at the data, what was very clear is before the war in Ukraine, inflation had reached over 6%, and was on an upward trajectory. So, I think they've misdiagnosed the problem. And I think there's very little hope from the leadership at the moment. I don't think they get it. But there is some hope because I think at the edges of policy circles, some people have started to take note of the link between the money supply and inflation. Obviously, this is a radio recording, so I can't show you the pretty chart, but I could show you a very pretty chart going back from 1918 to the current day in America, looking at broad money growth and inflation. And the correlation with an 18-month to 2-year lag is phenomenally close, beyond what could be really considered to be anything other than a near certain relationship. So quite why monetary ideas have fallen out of fashion at the central bank when they were in vogue in the 80s and parts of the 90s is a mystery. To me, there is interest in monetary theory actually in a number of emerging markets. But I think the academic environment has been dominated, and there's a political element to this, by a sort of Keynesian centralizing belief that if you pull this lever, this will happen, or we change this interest rate, this will happen, or we spend this money fiscally, that will happen. It's I think, very clunky view of the world, and I don't think it is a realistic view. So I hope going forward, we can make the case and we can show continuingly the correlation between the two. It won't be many occasions where there's a red flag like that, where the money supply spikes, God forbid, to that extent, again. But if it does, we will certainly make that warning, because as sure as night follows day, that will be a red flag on inflation.
The big challenge, of course, for us now is that obviously inflation is still too high, but it's not at the extreme levels of 2022, 23. In those days, Tim was getting an awful lot of coverage. I mean, looking at the news page of our website, you'll see no end of articles in that sort of period, because it was then particularly noticeable that Tim and the Institute was very much out on a limb in having predicted all this. And so therefore there was that degree of interest in what we were saying. But now, of course, okay, inflation's still too high, but it's not as bad as it was. And therefore we've got the challenge of pumping the message out when perhaps we haven't got such an obvious platform on which to launch it.
Yeah, I mean, currently inflation is 3.8%. That's virtually double the Bank of England's formal mandate.
Far too high.
Yeah, I mean, you do the maths, the compounding effect of 3.8% over, say, 10 years has a dramatic impact on people's savings. So the Bank of England continues to miss its target quite royally, to be honest. A good government has to control the growth in public spending, and very materially. And once, and only once, when the public finances are stabilized, can we then start to focus on growing the economy through some tax cuts. But so I think the Institute's got a big role to play, actually. Firstly, inflation remains stubbornly far too high. But secondly, the fiscal situation is extremely powerless. And I think that risks the monetary situation in the longer term. It's this crowding out of the private sector by the public sector, and the regulatory impact that I think is potentially going to embed inflation through the loop into monetary data. So, of course, we're unlikely to have the excitement that you guys had 3 years ago. And I hope we don't have that excitement again, I have to say, because that will imply the big, big bubble is on its way, inflationary bubble. But I think the message is as valid today as it has been. And I think that the actions of government risk monetization of that debt in the longer term, and we must try and resist that and warn and point out.
Well, thank you, Ewan. I think that it's very apparent from our discussion that you've come to the Institute with some experience of perhaps quite a different area of the economy in the past than perhaps Tim who's very much been focused on the money supply really throughout his entire career. But as I can see talking to you, just what a good match you will be, just bringing that particular area of expertise in and tying it in with our focus on broad money. And all I can say is you've joined us at what's going to be quite an interesting time for this country's economy, and I think really for the economy right across the world and the countries that we particularly focus on.
What we want is monetary stability. If we have monetary stability, it allows people to plan ahead and invest and look after their families without fear of having to second guess inflation or what the government might do next. So I think we're very focused on watching the money supply, broad money, that is, like a hawk, but equally convincing and trying to move the political debate towards a much freer, more laissez-faire, private sector orientated economy. And that will, to my mind, lead to a much more stable monetary environment, one where the state is less involved, is likely to be a more stable environment.
That sounds a challenge, but one that I think we will all enjoy working together with. It's certainly something that's very much needed, and I think the fact that taxes are so high and likely to get even higher, I think will open really a window for making the case for a smaller state in a way that perhaps hasn't been the case for many years. We've got some interesting times ahead, I think.
We do, John, and I look forward to working with you as well as Tim in the times ahead.